Marcus Webb was 41 years old when his wife said it, and she said it standing in the kitchen doorway of the house he had bought in Cincinnati, Ohio, with both credit cards fanned out in her hand, like a hand of cards she had already decided she was going to play. She had run them up over 11 months, $84,000 across 2 cards in his name alone, charged with the particular efficiency of someone who had been thinking about this for longer than the charges themselves suggested. Spa treatments, hotel suites, furniture for an address Marcus did not recognize, flights to cities she had not mentioned visiting. She fanned the cards out and set them on the counter with a sound that was too deliberate to be casual. And she said, "Sue me." She said it with the smile of a woman who believed she had correctly identified the limits of what the man in front of her was willing or able to do. Marcus looked at the cards. He looked at her. He said nothing. He picked up his coffee mug and turned back to the window and looked at the yard. The yard he had landscaped himself over 3 summers. The Japanese maple in the far left corner that he had planted as a sapling, and that now stood 11 feet tall with the composed authority of something that had been given time and correct conditions, and had become, quietly and without announcement, exactly what it was always going to be. What Lydia did not know, what she had constructed her smile around not knowing, was that Marcus Webb had sent those card statements, along with 17 months of bank records, 3 hotel receipts she had left in a jacket he had picked up from the dry cleaner, and a notarized account of a conversation their neighbor had overheard and documented at Marcus's request, to an attorney named Constance Aldridge 12 days before. Lydia fanned the cards across the kitchen counter. The filing had already been prepared. The motion for recovery of fraudulent marital debt had already been drafted. Constance Aldridge had reviewed it and had looked at Marcus across her desk and had smiled the smile of a woman who had spent 27 years doing this work and recognized immediately when a client had done the preparation correctly. She said, "Already done." What happened next would take everything Lydia believed was behind her and place it precisely, documented and unavoidable, in front of her. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Marcus Webb had grown up in Cincinnati, in the Avondale neighborhood, in a house his grandmother Viola kept, with the clean, purposeful order of a woman who had raised 4 children on a teacher's aide salary and had long since concluded that discipline was not a punishment, but a form of respect. For the space you inhabited, for the time you had been given, for the people who would come after you and find either a foundation or a ruin. Viola was 78 now, still in the house on Glenarm Avenue, still maintaining the same routines with the same precision. She had outlasted 2 mayors, 3 church pastors, and 1 neighborhood improvement initiative that had promised much and delivered sidewalks. She attended the same church she had attended for 51 years and sat in the same pew and had opinions about everything that she delivered without solicitation and without apology. And she was right often enough that people had stopped arguing and started writing things down. Marcus had absorbed her method without realizing it. He was a logistics and supply chain consultant, had been for 13 years, working independently after a decade at a firm that had taught him the architecture of moving things correctly, and a year of watching the firm mismanage its own operations before he had concluded that working for himself was the more rational arrangement. He was good at his work in the specific way of someone who understood systems from the inside, who understood that a system is only as sound as its least reliable component, and that the job of a consultant was not to admire the components that were working, but to identify the ones that were failing before the failure propagated. He applied this understanding to everything. It was not a choice. It was simply how he saw. He had met Lydia at a professional event in 2017, hosted by a supply chain association he had joined because his accountant had insisted networking was not optional. And Marcus had decided, as he decided most things, to do the required thing correctly rather than grudgingly. Lydia had been working in event planning at the time, organized and precise in the way that event planners are precise, attending to surface and sequence, and the management of impression. She had been genuinely good company that first evening. She had asked questions about his work that demonstrated she was listening rather than waiting for her turn to speak. And he had valued this, because it was rarer than it should have been. He had been careful with her in the way he was careful with things he recognized as worth the care. What he had recognized much later was that Lydia's precision was specifically directed. She was excellent at managing the impression she needed to make in any given moment. And she had needed to make a particular impression on Marcus Webb in the fall of 2017, which she had done with genuine skill. The skill did not extend to what came after the impression was established. What came after was a gradual loosening of the performance, the phone increasingly tilted, the evenings increasingly elsewhere, the quality of presence in the house shifting from genuine to obligatory to barely maintained. He had noticed each increment. He had stored each one. He had waited in the way Viola had waited for every difficult thing she had encountered in 78 years, for sufficient clarity before acting. The clarity had arrived in the form of a bank notification that arrived on a Wednesday morning while Marcus was reviewing a client project. He had a spending alert set on the secondary card, not because he suspected anything at that point, but because he ran his finances with the same systematic discipline he applied to his work. And monitoring was part of running a system correctly. The alert told him a charge of $4,200 had been made at a hotel in Louisville. He was in his home office in Cincinnati. He had not been to Louisville in 8 months. He had not reacted. He had opened a new spreadsheet and begun documenting. His hands did not shake. His face remained perfectly still. What the spreadsheet showed him over the next 3 weeks, as he pulled statements and cross-referenced dates and applied the same timeline methodology he used to trace failures in supply chain systems, was not impulsive spending, but deliberate, patterned accumulation. $84,000 across 11 months. Charged to cards in his name, on which he was the primary holder and therefore the primary obligant. The charges had a structure to them, small enough in any given week to avoid obvious pattern, large enough in aggregate to represent a sum that had been planned for rather than stumbled into. He had seen this kind of pattern before, in supply chain contexts, when a vendor was padding invoices. It was the pattern of a person who understood thresholds and respected them just enough to stay below them while exceeding the spirit of everyone. It was not impulsive. It was calculated. He built the documentation file over 4 weeks. Bank statements, card statements, the hotel receipts from the jacket the dry cleaner had found, and returned with the garment in a small sealed bag. A screenshot, provided by his neighbor Donald, of a text message conversation Donald had shown Marcus in person. Donald had heard a phone call through the shared fence on a Thursday evening that had been specific enough about finances and timing, and what Lydia intended to do that Donald, who had known Marcus for 6 years and had a strong sense of what right behavior looked like, had documented it on his own and shown it to Marcus without being asked. Marcus had thanked him. He had added it to the file. Then he had called Constance Aldridge. Constance Aldridge had practiced family and civil law in Cincinnati for 27 years from an office in Hyde Park that had the orderly, functional quality of a place where the work was taken seriously and the aesthetics were not the point. She was 59 years old, experienced past the point where experience surprised her, with a manner that communicated clearly that she had heard most things and been alarmed by almost none of them, and that the appropriate response to almost everything was careful and correct preparation. She reviewed Marcus's documentation file in a single sitting. When she looked up, she said, "The fraudulent debt motion is straightforward. You have documentation of the charges. You have the pattern. You have the neighbor's account. We file that separately from the dissolution, and it runs on its own timeline. She turned a page. The hotel receipts are useful corroboration, but not required. The spreadsheet you built is going to save us 3 weeks of discovery. She set the folder down. 12 days, she said. I want 12 days to prepare this correctly. Don't say anything at home. Don't change your routine. Don't give her any reason to move faster than she already has. She picked up her pen. And if she does something dramatic before we file, document it and call me immediately. Marcus had driven home that evening and eaten dinner and watched an hour of television and asked Lydia about her day, and she had told him about a catering vendor she was frustrated with. And he had listened and made one observation, and she had seemed, for a moment, to remember that he was perceptive. And then the moment had passed, and she had looked at her phone, and the evening had proceeded in. The flat and obligatory way evenings had been proceeding for months. He had gone to bed and lay in the dark and thought about the Japanese maple in the backyard, the sapling he had planted 8 years ago that had taken 3 full years to establish itself, and had seemed, in that first winter, too small and too exposed to survive the season. He had not moved it or sheltered it. He had given it the conditions it needed and left it to become what it was. It was 11 feet tall now. You didn't get that by rushing. 6 days after the kitchen counter, after the cards fanned out and the words spoken, and Marcus's non-response that Lydia had read as defeat, Constance filed. The motion for recovery of fraudulent marital debt was filed in Hamilton County Civil Court simultaneously with the dissolution petition in domestic relations. The fraudulent debt motion listed all $84,000 in charges, categorized by date, merchant, and documentation, accompanied by the spreadsheet Marcus had built, the bank and card statements, the hotel receipts, and Donald's notarized account. The motion argued, with the specific legal language Constance had spent 27 years learning to deploy correctly, that the charges represented unilateral marital waste incurred for the exclusive benefit of the charging party and her undisclosed associate, and that they were recoverable in full as a debt against Lydia's share of the marital estate. 3 days after that, Constance filed a second motion. This one was directed at the credit card company and named, in a request for discovery, the specific merchant records that would confirm what the hotel receipts already suggested. That several of the charges had been made in company with a second individual whose name and financial relationship to the charges was relevant to the recovery proceeding. The credit card company's legal team had seen enough of these motions to understand what was being built, and had produced the records within the statutory window without requiring a hearing. Marcus had, in the weeks following his conversation with Constance and before the kitchen counter moment, also had 2 other conversations that mattered. The first was with his accountant, Leonard Pierce, who was 61 years old and had been managing Marcus's finances since the 2nd year of his independent consulting practice, with the quiet precision of a man who regarded financial disorder as a personal failing and financial clarity as a basic courtesy to oneself. Leonard had reviewed the full financial picture, the consulting income, the retained earnings, the investment accounts that predated the marriage and had been maintained in Marcus's name alone as a matter of structural discipline rather than concealment, and the LC that Marcus had used since year 4 of the practice to hold the intellectual property he had developed for his methodology work. The LC held a licensed consulting framework, a step-by-step supply chain diagnostics methodology Marcus had developed over 5 years of independent practice, refined through 23 client engagements, and ultimately formalized into a documentable system he had filed and licensed. 3 mid-size logistics firms had contracted for use of the framework at an annual combined fee of $68,000. The contracts were in year 2 of 3-year terms. The income was clean, recurring, and appeared on no tax document Lydia had ever reviewed. She had never asked about the LLC. She had never asked how his practice generated income beyond his hourly billing rate. She had assumed a consultant's income was a consultant's income, which was the kind of assumption that people make when they have decided someone is the size of what is visible. Leonard had prepared a complete financial disclosure in 2 columns. The first showed what Lydia believed the marital estate contained. The second showed what it actually contained. The gap between the 2 columns was the gap between the assumption she had built her plan on and the reality she would eventually be standing in. Leonard had handed the document to Marcus and said, without inflection, she planned her exit very carefully and her information was very wrong. Marcus had read both columns. He had placed the document in his folder. He had said, "Thank you." That had been sufficient. The second conversation was with his Uncle Gerald, who was 65 and had retired from 22 years in the Cincinnati Police Department to a house in Delhi Township where he kept a garden and watched sports and dispensed advice with the brevity of a man who understood that the useful version of most things could be said in under a minute. Gerald had listened to the full account. He had not interrupted, and he had not offered expressions of sympathy, which Marcus appreciated, because sympathy was not what the situation required. When Marcus finished, Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she thought she was dealing with a man who would absorb the hit and move on. He looked at his nephew steadily. She was wrong about what kind of man you are. She was wrong about it from the beginning. He picked up his coffee. Let your lawyer work. Trust the documentation. Don't give her the satisfaction of a reaction before it's time. He paused. Your grandmother would tell you the same thing in about 40 more words. Marcus had laughed once, which was the first time he had laughed in 3 weeks. Gerald had nodded. There it is, he said. The settlement conference was held in a conference room at Constance's office in Hyde Park on a Thursday morning in March. Lydia arrived with an attorney named Preston Daly, who was competent and had clearly been briefed, but who had also clearly spent the preceding week discovering that the case he had been told he was entering was not the case that existed. Constance had sent the full discovery package, the financial disclosure, the fraudulent debt motion documentation, the credit card merchant records, the notarized neighbor account, the LLC disclosure, 10 days prior, which was 5 days more than required. Because Constance believed in giving opposing counsel sufficient time to understand what they were looking at and revise their expectations accordingly. Preston Daly had revised his expectations. Lydia had apparently not yet revised hers. She arrived with the same composure she had maintained through 11 months of careful charges and one dramatic kitchen counter moment, and it held for approximately 8 minutes. It held until Constance set the merchant records on the table. The ones that showed the hotel charges in Louisville and 2 other cities had been made on a room registered to a man named Derek Hollins, who was a regional sales manager for a distribution company, who had charged several of the same hotel stays on his own corporate card, creating a documentary record of their arrangement that was now part of the civil proceeding. Lydia's composure did not collapse. It simply thinned, the way a load-bearing element thins when the weight on it exceeds its design specification, becoming visibly inadequate before the final failure. Preston Daly asked for a 10-minute recess. They were gone 12. When they returned, the opening position had changed substantially. Marcus had sat through all of it, without expression. He was not cold. He was simply the same man he had been in the kitchen that morning, with the cards on the counter, present, observant. Already 3 moves past the moment Lydia thought was the decisive one. He had Viola's capacity for stillness and Gerald's understanding of what that stillness communicated to the people in the room who were paying attention. When the revised settlement position had been presented and reviewed and the numbers had been discussed, and Constance had made 3 specific adjustments that Preston Daly had initially resisted and then accepted. Marcus looked at Lydia directly for the first time since she had arrived. She was looking at the table. He waited until she looked up. "I want you to understand something," he said. His voice was even and without heat. "You stood in my kitchen and told me to sue you. I had already sued you. Not because I wanted to. Because you left me no other correct response." He let that sit for a moment. A system fails when its components stop doing what they were built to do. You stopped a long time ago. I just took the time to document it correctly before I did anything about it. He straightened the papers in front of him. "I don't have anything else to say." He nodded to Constance. He stood. He walked out. The hallway was carpeted and quiet. Outside, the March air was cold and clean and smelled like rain that had fallen earlier and stopped, leaving everything damp and precise, and Marcus stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in, and thought about the Japanese maple at home and whether it needed anything done before spring asserted itself, which it did not. The maple had been growing correctly for 8 years and required no intervention, only observation. He walked to his car. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. 13 months later, Marcus Webb was sitting on the back deck of the house on a Saturday morning in April. With his coffee and a project proposal he was reviewing for a new client in Louisville, which was a city he now associated with the hotel receipt and the dry cleaner bag rather than with anything else, which was a reassignment of meaning he had accepted and moved past with the efficiency he brought to most things. The Japanese maple was leafing out. It was 11 feet tall now, and the April light caught its first growth at an angle that made it look, for a moment, like it was illuminated from inside, which was not true, but was the kind of impression that the right conditions could produce in any well-established thing. He had planted it as a sapling 8 years ago, and had given it the correct soil and the correct light, and had watered it during the drought years, and had left it alone during the years it did not need him, and it had become exactly what he had understood, when he planted it, that it was going to become. That was the only kind of gardening he had ever been interested in. That was, in most respects, the only kind of anything he had ever been interested in. The house felt different now in the specific way that spaces feel different when they have been returned to their correct use. Inhabited by someone who chose to be there, rather than someone who was calculating their exit. He had repainted the kitchen in November, a warm gray he had considered for 2 years, and had replaced the kitchen hardware himself on a weekend, and had stood back afterward and looked at the room and found it, for the first time in a long while, simply a kitchen. Belonging to no particular drama, just a room in a house that worked. Teresa Cobb had come into his life through a client referral, which he had initially kept professional, and which had become something else with a gradual naturalness that suited him. She was a logistics analyst at a regional health system who asked questions about supply chain methodology with genuine curiosity, and who had, when he had explained the consulting framework he had developed, pushed back on one assumption in a way that had required him to think for 30 seconds before responding, which was the most interesting 30 seconds he could remember from a professional conversation in 2 years. She was direct and specific and did not perform her intelligence, which was a quality he found more valuable than almost any other. She was not on the deck with him this morning. She was inside, reading, because she had come over for dinner the previous evening and had stayed, and mornings like this, quiet, unhurried, each person doing their own thing in the same space without the need to account for the silence, were a kind of ease he had not known he was missing until he had it. What he knew of Lydia came through Constance, who had mentioned in passing, in the context of a closed matter, that the settlement had been finalized and that Lydia had relocated to northern Kentucky. Derek Hollins had ended the arrangement within a month of the proceedings becoming public, which Constance had predicted with the confidence of someone who had watched pressure reveal what people were actually made of a sufficient number of times to have stopped being surprised. Lydia's event planning business had contracted significantly. Several of her longer-standing clients had declined to renew. Her professional network in Cincinnati had redistributed itself in the direction of people whose names were not attached to civil fraud motions, which was where professional networks tended to move under those conditions. Marcus set the project proposal on the deck railing and looked at the maple. 11 feet. 8 years, 3 bad winters, and 1 summer drought that had required him to water it by hand for 6 weeks, which he had done without complaint every morning before work, because that was what the tree required, and because things that are worth having require what they require, and the only question is whether you are willing to do the work. He had been willing. He still was. He picked up his coffee. The morning was clear and quiet, and the maple was putting out its spring leaves in the particular reddish-green of its first growth of the season, which always looked improbable and always resolved into something dependable by summer. He had learned to trust that resolution. He had learned to trust most things that had shown him, over time and correctly, what they were. Some structures hold because they were built correctly and given time. That was the only kind worth building. He had known this since he was a boy in Viola's house on Glenarm Avenue, and he had never stopped knowing it. And it had never once been wrong. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.